Perfect. So welcome everybody, and welcome especially to our speaker, Kari, and her colleague, Natalia. I'm really delighted that you can join us from Copenhagen today. And we're going to be hearing more about the work that you've been doing. And we have had a few oh, we've got a bit of background noise there. I think that's Susanna, sorry. Thank you. We have had a few dairy related talks in the last year, probably because we've got Sarah. There's a slight likelihood that we're going to pick up more dairy because that is Sarah's area of interest. But yeah, really delighted that we're able to have you join us today. Oh, I've just lost your bio, so sorry, bear with me. I've got it here. Apologies about that. Sorry, I was just saying that I've been having a nightmare with putting in one of our research claims today, so I'm all over the place and not at all with it. So just bear with me a second. So sorry, Kari is a PhD student researching opportunities and barriers for green transition of dairy farming. So a bit of crossover with my work, which is really exciting. And her project is part of the interdisciplinary research project Cattle Crossroads at Copenhagen, where animal and vet sciences merge with anthropology. And that's also why we have Natalia joining us, who has been involved in an exhibition. And I just very quickly watched the short video that's on the website, Natalia, about the exhibition that's happening as part of Cattle Crossroads. So I will make sure we put a link to that particular video so everyone can watch it later. But I'm going to just hand over to you two to share your work with us. I think Sarah's asked you to present, and then we will come in with questions afterwards.
Thank you, Nikki. And was it about 40 minutes of presentation? Yes, perfect. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. The right one. All right, do you see it?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. All right, yeah, I will present some work I have done. I call it Situated Analysis of Food Supply and Land Use Efficiency. And as you mentioned, I am a PhD student, a part of the Cattle Crossroad project. Let's see. Yeah, researching Danish livestock production for the future. So it is an interdisciplinary project, and I would say my PhD project is quite unusual in animal science, as it is an iterative-based production. So it wasn't planned what I would look at before I started, only that we had this handful of alternative, as we call them, dairy farms as case farms, and then I had this figure to approach the work of dairy production and green transition. So the planetary boundary framework. I'm sure you have seen this figure before, with the 9 interlinked processes important for ensuring a stable climate here on Earth for us. So I've just so because the project was iterative, I was out exploring a wide area of subjects within cattle production, and one of the emerging themes was this theme about land and how we lose land and how much land we use, and as we can see in the figure, how we use land is related to a lot of these processes in different ways. So I found it a very important entry point for my work. So I have these case farms, and I wanted to make a analysis of their land use and their food production, because I think that's what it's all about, right? Producing food, and we have the basic resource, which is the land. So I had these 4 productions, and I will just briefly introduce them. The first one here is a dairy production, a small-scale dairy production on marginal soils, so soils that are not very suitable for cultivating an annual crop. And let's just get the numbers on it here. It had around 40 dairy cows and 47 hectares of land. And the feeding was primarily grass-based, but all the lactating cows were supplemented with some concentrate. Then we had Farm B, which were a very young farmer and also a very young farm. So I have these 30 to 40 cows. That's because the farm wasn't really quite entirely established when I started my the collection of production data. So I've collected production data from 2 years of production to 22 and 23. So by the end he had 40 cows and just under 60 hectares of land. And he went into this farming business with the intention of regenerating soils with dairy cows and holistic grazing. And they also have a farm dairy, so they process all of their milk themselves at the farm. Then we have the third farm, the Farm C. It's a feed no food mixed livestock crop system where all crops, annual crops, are sold for human consumption, and they keep all the surplus calves until slaughter at the farm. And it's around 130 dairy cows and 370 hectares of land. He bought some extra land the second year of production. And the final farm here, Farm D, is a high-yielding dairy farm with crop production. So also a mixed system, you can say, but with a completely different approach to the dairy part. 220 cows and 430 hectares of land. So normally in animal science, we would approach a farm analysis where we look at the feed. This is a very, very rough outline of how they feed the animals, at the dairy cows at this farm. This is the percent of the dry matter intake. So at Farm A it's 73% and Farm B 79%. This is how the lowest I would say it gets. It's rough estimates because the data are not very good, but it's based on the winter feeding. But obviously during the growth period, the pasture growth, depending on the pasture growth, they will consume a lot more of roughage or pasture forage. Then we have Farm C, which is 100% grass-based, and Farm D, which is the high-yielding with Holstein cattle. And he's just barely reaching the requirement for organic farming. They are all organic, by the way, which is that 60% of the dry matter intake should be from roughage. And you can see here the yield per cow per year differs quite substantially between the 3 first and the 4th. So we have quite high yields, especially for organic production. And this is the amount of milk sold to the dairy. So this is what we usually look at in animal science, where I said, also before I mentioned that I saw that land use were all over the place in this area of discussion, except in animal science here at the university. So I wanted to expand the focus. So the analysis I've made, I have estimated the total land use, so the direct land use, which is the land managed by the farmer, and the indirect land use, which I have estimated from the imported biomass. And then I have divided into different categories of land. So cultivated land, temporary grasslands, lays, permanent grassland, and then fallow land. And then instead of only including the animal output, I've also included the entire system output, because I think there's a value in keeping the intact systems instead of evaluating the productions in silos, you can say. So let's see here. Yeah. Here is an overview of of the total land use of the 4 farms, and I have the 2 production years for each farm. So you see with Farm A with the marginal soils, he has a lot of permanent, the green one is permanent grassland. The orange is lay, temporary grass. And the blue one, dark blue, is cultivated land. And then I have the light blue, it's fallow land, because in 23 there came new EU regulations where all farms with arable land should have 4% in fallow. But yeah, you can see that the type of land that supports these systems are quite different. Where the small scale both use a lot of grass. The grasslands, when I analyzed the farm, they were not very old, you can say. And the 2 larger farms, they had around the same use of cultivated land, but then Farm C had more permanent grassland than Farm D. So I think it's very interesting to see how different the land use practices are between farms with cattle. And it's always also interesting to see where is the land located. So I have this table here, and I just wanted to highlight how much of the total land use is managed by the farmer themselves. So actually, the 2 smaller farms have the lowest degree of self-sufficiency when we view it this way. Farm C have a very high degree of self-sufficiency with 97 or 96%, and Farm D is also quite high. 86% of his total land use is managed by himself. But the 2 smaller farms, they have both collaborations with local farmers. So I think I was interested in seeing how much of this land is actually unknown land. So that's the bottom here, and this is more in line with Farm D. So around these 12% of unknown land, which comes from bought feed from feedstuff companies. So we actually don't know where this is grown. It could be grown by the neighbor. It could be grown somewhere in Europe or in South America or whatnot. And I know that Farm D, he used a compound feed which included soy. So that was definitely not from Denmark. Yes, moving on to the food output, just to get an idea of the relations between the cattle and the crops. It's a quite messy table, but I just want to highlight that, of course, at these 2 farms where they only have dairy cows, they comprise 100% of both the human digestible energy output and the protein output. It is quality adjusted. That's the cue here. But at the feed no food mixed system, the dairy part only consists of or have like 23% share of the total dietary output, but almost 50% of the dietary protein output. So as we have seen many times that animals are more efficient protein producers than crops. And for the last farm here, you can see that even though it's a highly specialized, high-yielding dairy farm, crops do or can comprise a large part of the dietary energy output. And there's a huge variation between the 2 years, because as the farmer says, the cows are my main thing, but if there's any surplus, I will sell it. So in 22, it was a very good year for him, so he sold a lot of crops. 23 was not a very good year. So the crop wasn't, it didn't sell a lot. You can see down here in the protein part. Okay, I can just, yeah. For the crops that it only comprised 1%. So yeah, now you know a bit of the kind of outputs these farms have. And then I can say how much land are they using per dietary energy output or dietary protein output. And there are different ways you can look at this. So first, I tried to say, just see how much total land do they use per output. And this assumes that all land is the same, which is a questionable assumption. But through this lens of land use efficiency analysis, the two small farms seemed quite inefficient compared to the larger farms. And you can say there are more levels in this because these two are larger, but they have the mixed system also. And these are small, but have only have the animals. And I think the main difference is that they only have animals and they have crops also. But you can see the difference in when we view the protein is not that large as when we view the energy output. But I'm not very happy with this assumption. All land is the same, as we know it's not. We can say that we should really use the amount of arable land instead, because all permanent grassland, they serve other functions, such as biodiversity or other ecosystem services, and they are likely not to be very suitable for cultivation. That is often the case. So then the picture changes a bit, especially for the farmer with a lot of permanent grassland. So this was the farm with on the marginal soils. Farm B stands out as being very, very inefficient, so using a lot of arable land per output. And even though he used a lot of grasslands, many of them were very young, so that's why they come into this category of arable land. We could also go further and say we should use the cultivated land as the measuring unit, because all lays or temporary grassland, they serve a fertility building and system health function. And they would be necessary even if we didn't have the livestock. And the cultivated land with annual crops are the land that create the most environmental risks. And then we have this picture where this is the energy, the amount of land used per energy output. Farm A and Farm C seems in line. I mean, there are some crossovers, but it definitely changes the picture. There's a quite huge step at Farm B here between the years, because he cultivated quite a lot of land this year because he wanted to reestablish the grasslands, which he did not here. So so these three different lenses, they emphasize that the metrics you use to measure these farms change how we evaluate them, and these assumptions on the functions of land and are very important to be aware of when we evaluate. And if we see on this side here with the cultivated land and compared to the picture we got from the milk production, the conclusions are quite different. Excuse me. And then I just wanted also to, because this, I have in my calculations, I have used this quality adjusted protein, because typically we say that animal derived protein is of higher quality than plant protein, but this is also up to discussion. So if I hadn't adjusted for quality, this figure with the amount of land used per output would look like this. So this farmer here with a large percentage of crop output, he reflects better. So this is just to say that there are a lot of assumptions that lies behind these numbers. Okay, I will just drink some more water.
They kept wanting to jump in and say, if you need to stop and have a drink or a cough, then do so.
Okay, let's see if it works. So this is where I initially stopped my analysis, because I thought it was interesting, this with the different lenses of analysis and how we usually view dairy production and how that reflects on how these production reflects when we look at the land use. But I wanted to dive deeper into this feed food land-based feed food competition and land use ratio. So let's see here. Yeah, this study by Van Santen from 2016. She introduced the method of land use ratio, where you compare the animal output, so the food output from the animal production, with the potential plant-sourced output. Now I just more water. Yeah. So what could we yield from the same amount of land that the animal production occupied? And two more studies that I know of have used this method to estimate, is the animal production actually more efficient or less efficient than a thanks, I got a delivery. Yes. When is it more efficient, or when is it less efficient than a plant production could have been? So so the results from these papers, I've just collected them here. Van Santen, they modeled the two different dairy beef systems, and when I say dairy beef, it's the dairy production and the derived beef production. And Hennessy et al. 2021 modeled made some systems after Irish production standards, and then the last one had did an analysis of 25 Swiss dairy farms. So in the first one here, she showed that that it really matters what kind of land you use for the dairy production, whether or not it is more or less efficient than a pure plant production could have been. While none of the systems were more efficient when she analyzed it for energy, on the protein side, the dairy beef on primarily based on peat soils were found to be more efficient than a plant production could have been, because the peat soils were not assessed as suitable for cultivation. This next study, they found similarly that dairy beef, so again the dairy production including the derived beef production, were more efficient than a plant production could have been on the same area. However, when they did it the same estimation for a suckler beef production, they found that the plant production were more efficient, land efficient, or that they could yield more from the same piece of land. However, these two papers were model systems, whereas this final paper were actual farms and farm data, which I thought was interesting. But they didn't find that any of them, they grouped them into these three categories: lowland, hills, and mountain area farms. And again, none of them were more efficient when analyzed for energy. But the land use ratio for protein were lower, but only the mountain area farms were close to equilibrium or being more efficient. They did have a plot of these farms, and two of the four farms in this group had a protein land use ratio below 1. But I wanted to do this as well for my farms, to explore this subject more. But where these production were, you can see here, it was almost like the animals versus the plants here on this equation, and I really wanted to keep the systems intact, even though, because I think there's a lot of relations between the plant production and animal production, and great synergies as well. So actually 15 of these 25 farms were mixed farms, but these authors chose to extract the dairy part of those farms. But I insist on making having the systems intact when analyzed, even though it can create some more challenges or difficulties. So I had this equation instead of the plants versus the animals. So I just took the actual food production, and I already had this calculated. So the next step was to assess how large a percentage of the land use do I assess as suitable. This is a major part of the method, and also it affects the results dramatically. So the suitability assessment, and then also I had to set up a crop rotation for the plant production, and estimate the dietary energy and protein output per area. When I started to assess suitability, I ran into this issue, which wasn't discussed by any other papers. This about because I was doing it for organic productions, and this was not mentioned by the others. They use a lot of temporary grassland to provide nitrogen and so on, improve the crop rotation health. And are they necessary for the crop rotation, or are they not? Oh, so so the farmers, they say, so the feed no from farm C, the feed no food mixed system farmer, he says, I have this amount of clover grass in my rotation. It is 100% necessary for my system and for the health, for nitrogen and for weed control and disease control. And then I have the number of animals I can sustain with that amount of grass. So with the assumption that these lays are necessary, I have the first line of suitability shares. So farm A have around 15%, farm B have around 40, and farm C have 40, 41, 42, and the farm D have around 46% of suitable land. However, if we assume that lays are not essential even for organic production, that we are able to have healthy crop rotations in other ways, then the suitability percentage are much higher. So this assumption is extremely important for for the results of this with this method. So I estimated the land use ratio for protein and energy with both assumptions, and I have them here. So if we assume that the lays are important, they do not occupy an area where we otherwise could cultivate food crops. See that only farm A and farm B are close to being below one of the years. And it's also interesting to have the 2 years of production here, because you see the difference that what I have estimated that the potential 100% plant-sourced food production could yield. It doesn't fluctuate. I haven't been able to account for weather conditions and so on. So it's more rigid. But even despite that, it still provides an indication of the amount of land-based feed food composition. Looking at the protein land use ratios, several of them are actually below 1, where farm A with the lowest share of suitable land have the best score, and farm C is just around 1 actually, and farm D is in between those two. And immediately, as we know that farm C only it uses all of the cultivated land for food crops, these numbers should all be below 1. So that there's definitely some flaws, you can say, or some inability for this method, as I've used it, to adapt to local conditions. So it is likely that I have assumed too high yields for the sandy soils of this farm. But that also points to that even though estimates like these are interesting to put a number on efficiency, they should always be used with caution and with a closer look on the assumptions behind. Because as we see, if we assume that we don't need the lays, the numbers, the land use ratios are quite high for all farms, and only farm A, when analyzed for protein, is still below 1. We can see that farm D have quite high land use ratio numbers, and that is the combination of very suitable land and low input system. So I showed these results to the farmers, and he said, so really I should be a plant producer. It's just too bad that I'm passionate about dairy production. So maybe that also should count something, but we can talk about that later. Yes, but this is only, I've looked at land use efficiency and land use competition in regards to food production. But as we know, what happens if we take the animals away from the lands, it's not only the food output we don't have. There are other important relations to these animals. So this is pictures from the deep litter bedding from Farm A, which he gives to a vegetable producer. As I actually visited, me and Natalia, we visited this vegetable producer last week, and she said that it's an organic vegetable production, and they cultivate around 100 of hectares, and they get manure or slurry from 3 cattle productions and 3 pig productions. And on top of that, I don't think they get all of the manure from all of the of the farms, but she said that the 3 different pig and 3 different cattle productions they do receive some nutrients from, and they use meat and bone meal for quick fixes in the field. So even though it's a plant-based production, it's not independent of animals. And then again, there is some value of cattle that we can have an economic output from our fertility building, clover grass, and we know that having animals on soils do affect what happens in the soil and the life in the soil. When they are out on pastures, they do provide habitat for other species important to our environments. The dung beetle here, and this about biodiversity. It's highly discussed here in Denmark, and I'm sure also in the UK. That grazing animals are important for creating variation in landscapes. And this is, don't mind the Danish text, but this is one of the pastures from Farm A with high nature value. It's the dry meadow area. And I have this picture from Farm C, which is the wet meadow like pasture. This photo is taken in the winter time, so it was very wet. But he uses this mainly for the fattening of the surplus calves. And I also have this picture, again, don't mind the Danish text, but it's a picture from Farm A where you can see this farm, which were closer to the stable, and it got slurry once a year. It had not very many species, even though it had been permanent for 30 years or something like that. And it's because of the high pressure grazing and the nutrients that affects the species composition greatly compared to the surrounding more extensively grazed and areas which were not fertilized with slurry at all. This picture is from Farm B. He grazes the pastures with a holistic grazing method. This is a picture from August. And as you can see here on the left side is the pasture, and this strip of grass by the roadside had far more flowering flowers. And this puts attention to this, that often a high production and a high fertility soil is not good for at least a biodiversity loss mitigation, because what we lack in Denmark at least, is nutrient poor areas where species that are not so fast growing can have space. So I thought this picture was very illustrative in the way that we can't say that all pastures are good for biodiversity loss mitigation. Just an overview of the farms I had, the case farms that in the analysis, Farm A, he had 25% of his land, so the land he managed, were protected with by nature legislation, so he could not change the land from its state, and he could not fertilize it. And Farm C also had protected land areas. I mean, all of the farms were to some extent engaged in nature conservation, but Farm A and Farm C, when we look at the total land use, had 14 to 16% of their land use being high value for nature. I'm nearing the end here, but just one mention that there are also these relations to unintended consequences. So Farm C was the only one feeding soy-based concentrate. I will not go into further discussion, but I think it's an important aspect of land use, this about the dynamics between dynamics in our in a globalized world. And then what I will end off by asking what should decide the pathways forward for livestock. I think my analysis shows that that is extremely important to be aware of the assumptions behind the metrics you use for evaluating systems with livestock, and that is important to keep the relations in mind instead of only viewing at the animal isolated yield, that there are system perspectives that are extremely important, especially the flows of nutrients that I really wasn't able to quantify in this study, but I think it's very, I think it's completely essential to include that in the analysis, because there are so many interdependencies with these flows of nutrients, and that is what livestock are very good at. They can recycle nutrients to food crops. So if I should say some general things I have seen is that grass and grazing based production do make sense when we are working with ruminants. That is their major force, and that the use of land unsuited for production of food crops will decrease the amount of feed food competition. I think there are a lot of opportunities in mixed systems, and in a way you can say that the small farmers also were mixed systems because they just did it in a collaborative way. So they bought silage from organic plant producers in their local environment, and they exported manure. I just want to say 2 words about production resilience, because that's also a factor in this. The farmers, the farmer from Farm D, who also have a lot of grass, he has around half of his arable land in grass. He said about 2023, which were the worst year he has ever had for his annual crops. But he said we ended up landing on our feet because of the grass ability to compensate later in the year, and we know that very well. It saves us every time. So there can be some resilience or production insurance with having more grass also, because the annual crops are more insecure, you could say. The farmer from C, he said, yeah. if you have a drought and the crop is stress maturing, then it's gone. You don't get another shot. You do that with the grass. And I think the final point is the farmer's personal interest, which may be a bit controversial, but in Denmark, and I think in other parts of the world, it's a decreasing amount of people are interested in engaging in farming. And this young farmer, he is just passionate about dairy production. So that it comes to matter in a way in practice. I can say that the other farmers from Farm A, C, and D, they are 50, 60, and 70 years old, and they have none of their children wants to continue the production. So, and I'm sure there are more things that should decide the pathways for livestock, but that was just my input from this study. And then I will just end up by some wisdom I saw at the Museum of English Rural Life when I visited last spring. I enjoyed it a lot, and I saw this large collection of wagons where they write on the wall, a wagon can tell you much about the place where it was built and the landscape for which it was designed. One built for the Derbyshire landscape will be very different in size and shape to a Devon wagon. Most of the differences are practical. Wider wheels, for example, allow heavier loads to be spread evenly on soft, muddy ground. But some differences are mysterious. For instance, why did people in different parts of the country paint wagons in different colors? And then they say, the ideal wagon does not exist. What may suit one region is impractical for another. Just as a modern lorry would not fit down a narrow road in Devon, neither would a larger Lincolnshire wagon. Each vehicle is unique, whatever its imperfections. So in this way, I think that as there was no ideal wagon, there is no ideal farm, and I believe that the pathways forward should be closely linked to the unique context of farms, and that this development should be in continuous conversation with local environmental constraints and opportunities. Yes, I think that's it. Thank you.
Kari, that was brilliant, and massive well done for carrying on when you were clearly suffering a
Yeah,
little bit.
that was
Very
painful.
well done. And
Thanks.
have a big old gulp of whatever you've been brought. Hopefully it looks, I can't really see it. Maybe it's some whiskey or something in there. That should help.
It would be good.
I love that you finished with the Merle. What a brilliant place the Museum of English Rural Life is. It's wonderful. I was there a couple of years ago on a research trip whilst I was at Reading University, and I was so overexcited about being there. And none of the other researchers from elsewhere in Europe could quite understand my excitement. They were like, is this not just a normal museum? And I was like, no, this place is magical. So I love that you mentioned it. I think there are a couple of points which came up in the chat. I've got some questions as well. But there was a technical question from Susanna asking about the areas of ley and cultivated land. Sort of looks like they were similar, which might suggest that the farms on an arable rotation where the land is in cultivation for half the time, which sounded like a short ley period. So just trying to understand the amount of time that the leys are in place for.
Yeah, typically it is 2 years. Yeah, but the farmer at Farm D, he had also 3 year of temporary ley.
Feels quite short for an organic system.
Yep.
Compared to the UK. So
Okay.
Would that be standard in Denmark?
That is very standard in okay. Denmark. Yeah. So it's usually the most normal is a 2+3 system. So you have 2 years of grass and then we have 3 years of crops. But it can also be like the other way around. So we have 3 years with depends on the specific field, of course, and the crop they want to have after. Typically, they can have longer lay years before wheat if they want to sell it for bread wheat. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes.
Thank you. It's always interesting where, similar sorts of system typologies, actually that there's a big difference between a 2-year lay, for example, or maybe 4 or 5-year grass lay that you would find particularly in organic systems here. So that's really interesting difference. There were some questions from Ian relating to the human edible protein crops growing in Swiss mountain areas. There was a little bit of discussion then that Suzanne and I got involved in about historic terraces, or a little bit like in Scotland here, where there's this assumption that you can't kind of grow crops in particular areas, but we know historically that did happen. So we had a little bit of discussion as you were chatting about the kind of land capability. Are you able to talk a little bit about that, the kind of potential protein production that would have been identified in mountainous areas?
I don't know anything about this production in mountainous area, but I think it's interesting what makes an area suitable for production, because that is a discussion we have here in Denmark, at least, that we have drained almost the entire country, and we have created a lot of arable fields that naturally wouldn't be possible to cultivate. So what is actually a suitable land area? And now we have major issues in Denmark with eutrophication in our coastal areas, because 60% of Denmark is cultivated, and we have a lot of leaching to the water environments. So could that also be a constraint that is not suitable, because it create all of these environmental problems? So this issue or this question of what makes an area suitable for cultivation is a crucial question, actually. Also, when we look at the land use ratio method, which is mainly based on this assessment, and it is an assessment that is very difficult to make. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I have some questions about the figures, but if anyone else has questions, please do pop your hand up. And Natalia, I don't know if you want to come in and talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing in the same project, but before you do, if I could just ask a question, going back to the slide you had with basically all of the numbers in terms of your calculations relating to actual food production. And I don't know if it's because it's a Friday and it's the end of the day, but I'm just wondering if you could just talk back through that, and just kind of with a very layman's terms, so what kind of.
Which slide was it?
This slide. So like, I think it is just because I've been looking at a lot of numbers this week, and I'm just trying to get my head around what it is. What is this slide telling us in the most basic kind of layman's terms?
Yeah. Okay. So it's telling us that, let's see here. Okay. If we assume that lays are important and we would have them no matter if we had livestock or not, it says that farm A is more likely to be more efficient than a plant production could have been of the same area, because the land use ratio is below 1 or close to below 1 when we say this. And the same is the case for farm C, and for protein also farm D. So farm D is a more efficient protein producer than a food crop production could have been.
If we take into account that lays are important, that's the bit that I was struggling to understand.
Exactly.
The kind of, what is the underpinning, the lay bit? I was like, okay, so is this with the lays or without lays? But we are saying that we're making an assumption that lays are important regardless of what we're producing because of their fertility building.
Yeah, we would have them even though we didn't have the animals. Yeah.
Okay. And then the assumption would be at that point that they would just be mulched, or they would be mown and the crop removed. What was the assumption with the lay treatment if the animals weren't there?
I guess if the animals weren't there, they would be either cut and mulched, or just cut and they would make some compost of it, like plant compost.
So it would still go back onto that same land, it just wouldn't go through an animal as done. Okay.
Yeah, but this is a part I actually haven't made the calculations, and you can say in many ways this is imperfect estimates because I didn't have the full nutrient cycle and calculations made. So it's definitely an important point to expand on.
So without stealing the thunder of your PhD, where your kind of final, that key line in the abstract, that's going to be what you found. Essentially, it kind of depends on the farm, right? As to whether it's more appropriate to be producing plant protein or meat or animal-based protein.
Yes.
That we cannot possibly just say one is better than the other. Because actually this isn't necessarily the case for varying farms, and particularly if we take into account things like biodiversity outcomes and other trade-offs.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Susanna had a question. You put your hand up and then went back down, but so maybe Susanna, do you want to come in and then Ian?
Yeah, you sort of asked it for me because I was also wondering about how the differences between having animals on a lay and not having them would go back into the calculations, but I think you've covered that now. Thanks.
Okay. Ian.
Hi, Nikki. More an observation than a question, really, but picking up on what you just said. The very interesting, Kari, to hear your presentation. It's interesting that the plant-based production that you mentioned at one stage was relying on nutrients being brought in from livestock holdings in order to provide its fertility. And the other thing that immediately came to mind following what you were just saying about the lays and their importance, George Monbiot's championed the work of Ian Tolhurst and how much food he produces off small areas of land. But he does do fantastic things. But when you look at what Ian Tolhurst's system is, he's bringing huge amounts of wood chip in every year in order to bring carbon onto the site to make up for what's being released on the site by the intensive cultivations that he's doing. So there's an awful lot of nuance missing from a lot of the discussion around the differences between animal-based production or production incorporating animals and purely plant-based production. And without a proper agricultural understanding of the systems that you're looking at, it starts to get very, very difficult to comprehensively assess the relative outputs of the two systems in a way that would actually transfer into practice.
Yeah, I agree.
Susanna.
Yeah, sorry, me again. Yeah, I think I'd like to just add a bit to what Ian was saying about the levels of nuance that they can go on forever, really. But one thing that just came to mind is I'm quite keen on heritage grain, and I've grown some wheat this year, which is a fairly old variety. And one thing I'm really excited about is if you look at studies looking at different levels of micronutrients in different crops, often the old varieties that were originally grown in organic systems have much better root structures and take up a lot more micronutrients. So actually the nutrition we get from different grains can be really variable, and that's something else that would be really interesting to be able to incorporate. And I think also, yeah, it would be really interesting to see this kind of study going forward, considering more farming systems where the cropping is solely for human consumption, and then maybe you would have a longer lay period, but more nutrients going straight to humans off the field. That would be really interesting to see as well.
Yeah.
It's the Ian and Susanna show. I like this. We're like table tennis between the two. Come on, Ian, over to you.
Another point, one that I'm sure you're fully well aware of. It's interesting looking at the slide that's in front of us right now, the big differences between the energy land use assessment and the protein land use assessment. The point needs to come out much more in academic comparisons that people consume animal source products for their protein content. They are a protein food in the human diet. They are not an energy food. They do provide some energy, and some more than others, but you don't go eating yogurt or a beef steak or something like that for a quick energy hit. So are energy comparisons for land use ever really an appropriate thing to do for a comparison between plant and animal source food?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, how we should measure this food supply, and I also analyzed the percentage or the number of people that these farms could sustain, both from an energy point of view and from a protein point of view. And all of these farms can sustain more people with their protein output than their energy output. Where I think the two specialized, the farms with only cattle, they could sustain 62% more people based on their protein than the energy, where farm C only could sustain 20% more people with its protein output. And I also looked at the crop rotations that are used to estimate these land use ratios. Would they be able to provide both protein and energy needs for people? And I found that they could supply both around the same number of people, depending on what crops you have. But it's definitely possible to have a crop rotation that also provide more protein than energy for for more people. But yeah, it's a question: should we have like specialized protein farms, protein productions, or if I think actually that energy is a quite good measure for food supply. But again, this is quite long outside my own field of expertise, but I think it's very interesting to discuss what kind of measures are really good measures for comparison. Yeah.
Kari, I just put a link in the chat to a project that we are one of the partners in, the Pathways project. So when you were talking about pathways, and we have the feed no food scenario that we're developing as part of that, and so there's massive overlap between your work and the work that's happening there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I love most about that project is that we have a work package that is about developing food baskets. So, you know, if we take into account all of these different environmental impacts, welfare impacts, social impacts, and then we kind of take food baskets that represent the optimal pathway, and what's in that basket and how does that reflect kind of all of the different impacts that I've listed. You know, the kind of so what, you know, how sustainable is that food basket? And my favorite thing is that we have some brilliant Italian and French researchers who get very upset when anyone ever tries to reduce food down to just calorie or protein or energy or whatever it is. You know, they're just like, that is not what food is. Food is so much more than that. And it's really great to have that reminder all the time that, you know, food is so much more than just its component parts. And I think quite often modeled systems can really forget that. And I think particularly in the UK, where we do not have a good food culture, I think it's easier in other countries where there's a strong food culture to remember that. But here, quite often it feels that a policy brief may be developed as a result of some research that says plants are better for people because of X, Y, and Z than animals, and that lack of food culture then kind of means that that doesn't get kind of challenged in any way. And quite often it's just like, oh, well, there's a black or white solution here and we can go down that route. And I think, yeah, it's always, that's one of the joys of, even though I was moaning earlier about the financial claiming process, one of the joys of European projects is that you do get to engage in these kind of conversations around food culture. And I'm sure that's something you must have come across in your reading around this research.
Definitely. I'm sure Natalia would agree completely with you that food is more than just protein and calories. Yes, definitely, and also the quality of the food output, even between dairy productions, that we have seen that grass-fed dairy cows have a healthier fatty acid composition in the milk. So there are like a multitude of nuances indeed. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I'd really like to invite Natalia to maybe share some of her work with us or talk a little bit about her role in the project. Is there anyone else who's got a question for Kari first? No? Okay, Natalia, are you able to talk a little bit about what you've been doing as part of the project?
Yeah, hello everybody. So my name is Natalia Brichet and I'm a social anthropologist. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Kari, do you mind stopping screen sharing and then we'll be able
yes,
to
of
see?
course.
Yeah, don't worry, it's fine. But yeah, we can hear you, Natalia.
Okay, yeah. So I'm a social anthropologist, and as Kari mentioned, I've made an exhibition also here at the department. And actually, so I have questions to all of you, but let me just talk briefly about the exhibition here, because we were making it because in Denmark there's these very tense discussions about, you know, what kind of livestock production should we have in the future. And sometimes it tends to be like a trench war. So you have really the people who think that we should just get rid of all these livestock animals and then just have nature parks with bisons and exmoor ponies and stuff like that. And then you have pro-production people saying that we should continue because we're so efficient and we're so good in producing huge amounts of animals in Denmark, and we do it with low feed consumption, low antimicrobial use, and stuff like that. So, and these kind of discussions can really often end in people not talking together. So the whole idea with this exhibition was to make somehow a space where these difficult discussions could be taken, and to show what's actually the challenges and possibilities with having these livestocks. And very quickly we saw, just from discussing with researchers at this place, we are both based here at the former Royal Veterinary what do we call it? Veterinary Agricultural School in Copenhagen. And so when you dive into the research, it's all geared towards this intensive, optimized production. So the exhibition is actually mostly about what both Kari and I are not working with, but more the intensive production. And so we invite people in and they get a glimpse of what is going on in the barns. And many, many people are just not aware about what's actually going on and also about the challenges and where we see possibilities. So I think it has created a lot of debate and a lot of reflection and questionings, and yeah. And actually it's an exhibition that both the industry, if you can call it that, they are actually quite happy about it. And but also critics of the industry are also happy about it, because somehow we share, and somehow the exhibition is not blaming anyone, but if it's blaming or raising some issues, it's more systemic sort of critique, you could say. So that's the exhibition. Yeah. And so back to presentation that Kari gave, because I'm really interested in also in the in how you actually discuss these things in the UK. And so I just mentioned that in Denmark we have this discussion that either you shouldn't have any livestock animals or you should just continue. And so I visited the RVC this spring, and just talked to researchers there. And I asked, but where are all your cattle PhDs? Where are all your cattle researchers and pig researchers? Because all of them, they were just studying, or not just, but they were going into poultry production. And so I got the impression that most of the researchers, at least at the RVC, they said, oh, cattle production, we in some years, maybe in a decade or something like that, we won't do cattle or pigs. We will concentrate on poultry farming. And I think that was really, really an interesting answer. And also, I mean, something that maybe it will go the same way here in Denmark, because cattle are really blamed for being these methane factories and causing all kind of troubles. And always when we say you have to think the cattle into the landscape, and you have to think about the cattle in different ways. Even biologists with specializing in biodiversity, they don't believe that cattle can raise in appropriate ways, because they always overgraze, and that's because they just are out there in too big numbers. So there's something about, you know, our imaginations and our understanding on how these animals, and especially the cattle maybe, can be thought into landscapes in ways that Kari also showed in her presentation. So do you have some thoughts about these kind of developments in future livestock production? What is the role? And if we're turning everything into nature parks, should we then inhabit them with these exotic species such as bisons and ponies and stuff like that? Or yeah, that's it from me from now.
Thanks, Natalia. I'm smiling because I'm currently embroiled in a debate on Twitter about exactly that thing. So I will not make comment and open up to the space for anyone else who wants to respond to your question.
I'll have a go.
Go on, Johnny.
Do you want an answer to what I think might happen, or what I would like to happen?
Both.
Okay. I was hoping you weren't going to say that. What I would like to happen is that we use local livestock for doing the job of nature restoration that make sense in the environment that they're trying to restore, and that doesn't mean the current news, the aurochs, whatever they were called, coming into Scotland. In that landscape, there are already some Highland cattle, and they have developed over centuries to be the animals that they are. So why shouldn't we just use them? That's definitely what I would like to see, is doing that. Do I think that's actually going to happen? It will do on large portions of land, but I feel sure that there are always going to be how can I say this nicely? There are always going to be the people that think that they know best from probably outside whatever region it is that they've come in charge of, and they're going to be bringing in all sorts of exotic animals that I presume it will be shown that actually that doesn't work, and that having elephants in Perthshire or Denmark definitely doesn't make sense. But in Tanzania, it does.
Thanks, Johnny. I definitely think, I mean, we're starting to see a stratification, I think, in our systems in the UK. And I'm sure that this is the case in other places from some of the work we do across Europe, where we're seeing a significant intensification of some systems and a significant input intensification, but that is actually becoming more knowledge intensive. And often then by academics, it's classed as extensive, but in many places that isn't what it really is. It's a knowledge or management intensive, but it may have fewer inputs. And I think that stratification is definitely happening. And what we are seeing is quite a lot of, particularly in some parts of England, particularly around the Wye Valley, where it's becoming more challenging to manage livestock in kind of wetter areas, that farmers are going down an intensive poultry situation. And we get a lot of this in Scotland with intensive pig systems, where they're kind of managing to put everything in a shed and totally offshore all of the impacts and all of the requirements for input and for feed. I will, though, say in Scotland, in most of the intensive pig, a lot of it's attached to an arable farm. So there is still a lot of like homegrown protein for those pigs. So there is more of that happening in Scotland. I'm not quite sure if it's the case further south, but it's definitely been happening here where I live. But I do think there's a lot of farms that are kind of getting a lot of money, making a huge amount of money from an intensive pig or an intensive poultry unit, because it doesn't have a big land footprint on their farm, but it allows high levels of throughput. And it also, because there's no polluter pays requirement, there's no kind of at the moment, there's no kind of management of that nutrient load of where that's going. And it's kind of just offshored. And so it becomes less important to that particular farmer. So that's definitely something that's been happening. Catherine, I think, was going to come in. If you want to, Catherine, please do.
Yes, sorry, just had to take a quick phone call about a trespassing bull, not ours.
As long as it's not one of those Tauros big ones that's rampaging about.
No,
Okay.
it's somebody else's bull trespassing on our land fortunately not with any heifers. So I've forgotten what I was going to say now. I think there is a desire, and sorry, Nikki, I missed most of what you were saying as a result. There seems to be a desire to kind of find a quick fix solution, whether it's cattle are bad and all have to go, or we must all eat plants, or whatever. And the actual answer is far more nuanced and complicated. And we can't just distill it down to a very, very simple answer. There's got to be, and I don't know how we get that message across. But it's like you were saying, Nikki, about the value of food. It's not just about calories and protein. It's so much more than that. And how do we educate people about food and make them appreciate food in all its glory? That's it, really. So it's not an answer. It's a bigger question.
Thanks, Catherine. Any other reflections from Natalia? Ian?
For some reason I was having trouble unmuting. Not like me. Yeah, I just throw in that I read a really interesting preprint paper yesterday, looking at the impact or a thorough analysis of life cycle assessment of precision proteins, the technological protein alternatives, which are often promoted as an alternative to farmed livestock for a protein source. And one of the comments that was made in there, and supported with quite a lot of evidence, is that an awful lot of these fermented protein operations are casting around for a cost-effective nutrient feedstock, and that one of the feedstocks that they're settling on is derived from soybean meal, and that, ironically, that means that they have the potential to be at least as bad as intensive pig and poultry units in terms of their footprint for deforestation in third-party countries where the cheap soya is grown to actually feed these things. So the whole point about nuance in these systems and a comprehensive understanding of the whole impact of the system is really important. It's very easy to draw the boundaries around your assessment of a food system in such a way that you make one system look better than another, simply because you're you're ignoring some key externalities of it. And the point that Nikki's just made about the offshoring of the impacts of the protein sourcing and some of the energy sourcing for the most intensive pig and poultry units in the UK is a really good one. The vast majority of soya protein goes into pigs and poultry, and yet we're told repeatedly that if we're going to continue to eat animal source foods for their protein, then the most efficient ones are pigs and poultry.
I'm conscious that we're nearly at 4 o'clock, but I think one thing just to possibly add to that as well is yeah, the kind of what I found was interesting, and one of the things that jumped out at me in your presentation, Kari, was that Farm C, which was 100% pasture fed, had a higher yield, milk yield, than Farm B, which was feeding, I think, 20% concentrate. And I kind of find that interesting. And there'll be lots of different reasons why that could be the case, or might be the case, and it could be, type of cow or other management situations. But quite often I think, and it reminded me of a conversation I had on farm this week with a farmer who stopped feeding creep, so concentrate feed, to calves. So she is one of the only big suckler herds around here in Aberdeenshire that doesn't feed creep at all. And I asked her if she used to and why did she stop. And she said she stopped because the animals just got bad feet. So they were getting too much protein and it caused them to have bad feet. And she also felt that only the big calves did well and the small calves didn't so well. And that reminded me of something I think, Johnny, you found exactly the same on your farm. Doug Christie found exactly the same, and that there was no difference to growth rates. And I think there's something about farms that are using inputs, that transition period, so many tell us that there was either no difference in output when they stopped that. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be the same for Farm D with its very high performing Holstein cattle that have been, they're kind of bred to that system. But for farms that are kind of at that lower, like Farm B and Farm C, I bet if Farm B cut down their concentrate, they might not see that much difference of yield change and their costs would reduce. And so I think there's something about these farms that are kind of in the middle, that aren't super extensive or super intensive. These ones in the middle, if they're not stratifying either way, have a real opportunity to make a significant difference, because actually if they just reduce concentrate use or they just shifted some of their practice, there's a lot of those farms in the middle. And quite often I think we forget about them, that a lot of those farms doing something slightly better could have a significant difference to the kind of sector as a whole. But those are my totally unscientific kind of just thoughts from having, and reflections, having listened to you today and spent, linking that back to some other conversations I've had.
Yes, I just wanted to briefly comment on this, because Farm B actually started out with being 100% grass-fed.
Oh.
But also he had no experience from before, and he had trouble with very bad pasture quality, so he didn't have like the hang of it yet, because he was so new. So I would imagine that in the future he will reduce the amount of concentrate that he feed when he has this, when he have the genetics in place, when he has the management practices. Yes, indeed. And also see there's a lot of opportunities, because this practice or this production method is not normal in Denmark, so we don't have consultants or people that can advise the farmers in these types of dairy production. So that is also a major barrier for enforcing grass-based dairy production in Denmark, at least.
Well, luckily, Kari, we have consultants who can help those farmers. So if you want to send them our way, touting for a bit of business there. But, we would be more than happy to, even if it was a webinar or if it was something. So if you have farmers that you are connected with through your work who would be interested in learning a bit more about grass-based systems and kind of how they shift their system, then do please put them in touch with us. And I'm sure we'd be able to organize something, or through an extension service or something. We definitely would be. I'm doing a webinar for some Estonian farmers in a couple of weeks. So it's
Cool.
it's something that we do quite a lot of. We do engage with our European partners.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to draw things to a close there because I have another meeting starting in 2 minutes. Natalia, sorry, do you want to just to say something?
Yeah, so, but if you have another meeting, but I was just interested in the, Susanna, she mentioned the micronutrients and her interest in that. And in Denmark right now, we are talking about biogas. That's just such a huge thing. Do you have any literature or knowledge as to the quality of this biogas? I mean, the manure, it's used as fertilizer now in Denmark, and I think in the future more and more. So do you have any sort of experience with the quality of that kind of, fertilizer?
We have a lot of that happening around where we are. I don't know if anyone at Johnny, is that something that you've kind of come across? I'm going to have to go just because of the timing, but I will leave you guys to it. Kari, Natalia, thank you so much. And I'm going to leave you in Sarah's capable hands to close out the meeting.
Thank you, Nikki.
As Nikki just passed on to me there, I'll tackle that. I don't have any data absolutely, but what we found anecdotally is that fertilizer that comes out of an anaerobic digester or biogas or something is okay, but it's just there. It's not alive. It's not increasing life in the soil. All it's doing is replacing some nutrients. So in order for it to actually be useful, it needs to be alive, and it needs to be the food for some kind of biological something or other that is going to expand. And at that point, it's useful on the soil.
Okay, that was also what I would imagine.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I don't know if this is that relevant, but where I am, which is West Wales, so there's a lot of livestock production and very little else. Farmers are really struggling to get straw now at a reasonable price, because in the east, where we've specialised in arable farming, the straw's going into anaerobic digestion plants straight away. So we've sort of disrupted that cycle of mixed farming where you have straw for bedding available locally.
Yeah, I think Nikki mentioned that we'd gone to Northern Ireland recently, and for them that's a specific issue, that they don't have any straw for bedding. So most of their livestock are on slats without deep bedding. And then they've also, as a sort of as a policy, they're pushing for methane to be used as a gas, but they're finding that they don't have enough dry matter in their biodigesters. So it's sort of a cycle that you can never get out of. So it sounds like there's lots of issues there with what you feed it with, and whether there's enough carbon there to begin with, and all these kind of complications. But interesting. On that note, it's 1 minute past 4, so I think I will draw it to a close and press stop on that recording button. But thank you so much to both Natalia and to Kari for coming today and for your presentation. It was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we can keep in touch from this talk today, and no doubt quite a lot of our paths cross in similar directions, so it'd be good to catch up again soon.
Yes, definitely. I'm also coming to Reading in November. So
I gathered we were talking to Lawrence at lunchtime. So yeah, do get in touch when you're over. That'd be fantastic.
all right. Thank you all.
Nice to see you all. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.